A crowd of spectators watch in horror as another heavy stone is loaded onto the board. Underneath it, Giles Corey is suffocating. His ribs snap, his lungs collapse, and his heart is failing. As he opens his mouth, the crowd listens for a confession, a plea for mercy. Instead, Corey is defiant. "Damn you! I curse you and Salem!" he growls as the weight pushes down on him. What happened that day in Salem, Massachusetts in 1692 became one of the cruelest deaths in American history. In today's episode of the Infographic Show, we'll look at one of the worst deaths in history, crushing. What happened to Giles is a terrifying tale that also involves his very unfortunate wife. But before we get to that, we'll discuss the punishment known as crushing. The process is self-explanatory, although throughout history various cultures have put their own spin on crushing people to death. In parts of Asia, the condemned was sometimes crushed under the feet of a trained elephant. In the 13th century, the Mongols would put defeated nobles under a large wooden platform and hold a party on top of it. The men underneath had the life squeezed out of them. But the kind of crushing death we're interested in today is a slow, agonizing execution that could last for days. This kind of execution was known as a hard and forceful punishment, usually reserved for people who refused to issue a plea in court. Sometimes the accused would remain silent because a plea in a capital offense could mean the person's property was forfeited by the authorities. If they died without speaking, their property went to their families. For this reason, the authorities tried to generate as much agony as possible so that anyone in their right mind would plead. It seems like the authorities met their match with Giles Corey. Giles was one of the many Englishmen who went to the colonies to try to start a new life. Despite being accused of some petty crimes, he did quite well for himself in the Puritan settlement of Salem Village. His occupation was farming, as was the case for many landowners. He made use of young, poor people who'd been sent over or forced over to the colonies to labor as indentured servants. Surviving servitude on a plantation was hard. 25% to 50% were worked to death, starved, or died from disease before their contract ended. And then you had bosses like Giles who beat one of his servants to death for stealing an apple from his brother-in-law, something Giles would come to regret. Giles got away with just paying a fine for the murder, since whipping servants wasn't against the law, but his reputation was now sullied. 16 years later, when Salem descended into a superstitious witch-hunting frenzy, Giles would learn that people have long memories. It wasn't Giles who first caught the eye of the authorities when young girls began saying their fits and convulsions were the work of local witches. His wife Martha was the one in the spotlight. On March 19, 1692, Martha became one of the 200 or more people, mostly women, accused of being a witch in what we now know as the Salem Witch Trials. In what became an astonishing outbreak of paranoid hysteria, 54 people confessed, hoping to save their skin. 19 were executed, 14 women and 5 men, after being found guilty of being in league with Satan. One of them, Dorcas Good, was just 4 years old. The 19 were executed by hanging, but Giles got the very worst of Salem's punishments. Martha had been outspoken about the trials, contending that witches and wizards had nothing to do with these girls' strange behavior. She openly criticized the trials, and notably the judges who presided over them. Then 2 girls aged 12 and 14 accused Martha of being a witch and bewitching them. The court records show Martha's specter had choked and blinded the girls in a most grievous manner. This was what was called spectral evidence, much of it given by children with vivid imaginations and perhaps grudges to bear. Was Martha being punished for being a critic of superstition? Probably. She also had an illegitimate son, which was frowned upon in Puritan Salem. At her trial, she waved off accusations, but it didn't help that the girls she supposedly bewitched had fits in the courtroom when Martha looked their way. They also claimed to see a yellow bird flying above Martha's head. The trial reporter noted that when Martha bit her lip, several of the afflicted children's lips were simultaneously bitten. And when she moved her hands, the girls felt something pinching them. What else was there to say other than, "Witch"? You'd think when things got this bad, her husband might have had her back, but Giles made things worse. He testified that his ox had strangely become lame one day, as if it had been shot. He also said his cat took a funny turn, and then he remembered one time seeing Martha kneeling by the hearth in some kind of weird silent prayer. Giles wins the Most Cowardly Disloyal Husband in Salem award, but soon he had a change of heart and attempted to recant his testimony. This only created superstition that he too was in league with the devil. Mouths started wagging. People remembered him beating that kid to death over a solitary apple. Some had always been envious of his wealth. About a month after Martha had her day in court, a girl named Abigail Hobbs confessed to witchcraft and testified that Martha and Giles were her fellow witches. More than a dozen people testified that Giles had served bread and wine at a sacrament where as many as 50 witches had been in attendance. In court, they had to tie his hands since his spectral form was said to be hurting the girls. He refused to plead in the court, saying the court had already made up its mind and there was no way he would be tried by God and my country. The term used for not making a plea was standing mute. In his own words, Giles accepted whatever death they would put him to. And oh boy, were they going to make him pay for his defiant muteness. His sentence was to be pressed to death, which was highly unusual given that this procedure had been determined illegal by the government of Massachusetts. In fact, Giles would become the only person in the history of the New World and later the United States to be crushed to death by law. Remember, Giles's property couldn't be seized by the authorities if he could stay quiet during his execution. And we are talking about quite a lot of land here. If Giles could get through the crushing without making a plea, his extensive land and houses would go to his sons-in-law, William Cleves and John Moulton. He was also 81, so he might not have felt too bad about sacrificing himself. On September 18, 1692, Giles was led out of his cell and taken to a field close to the jail. They laid him naked on the floor and placed a board over his chest. Sheriff George Corwin presided over the punishment, as Giles's neighbors, many of them who didn't much like him for his violent ways, were witnesses. Giles didn't breathe a word as stones were piled on top of the board. At times, Sheriff Corwin would even mount the board himself. Giles still didn't speak. After a day of this, he was fed old bread and water. They didn't want him to die, they wanted to crush a plea out of him. As more stones were added, it's likely his ribs would have been broken, causing excruciating pain and making it harder and harder to breathe. His chest walls would have slowly collapsed, damaging his internal organs. He would have been in a state of panic, possibly close to a heart attack. And yet, when they asked him time and again if he wanted to issue a plea, he refused. At one point during the second day of crushing, witnesses noticed Giles's tongue hanging out of his mouth. He was obviously close to death. The sheriff used his cane to shove the tongue back in. As Giles was evidently about to die, the sheriff asked him again if he had anything to say. Some witnesses later said Giles managed to mutter the final request, "More weight." The sheriff, enraged, piled on more stones. Other witnesses later said the last words before Giles passed away were actually, "Damn you, I curse you and Salem." Either way, both statements are pretty cool. Martha was hanged 3 days later on September 22nd. In time, Giles would be absolved of his crime. Martha would not. Here is the twist on the story. It turns out that Sheriff Corwin had threatened Giles prior to the execution, saying he would take Giles's estate whether he issued a plea or not. Corwin really wanted Giles's land. Fast forward to 1710. Giles's son-in-law, John Moulton, and his wife, Giles's daughter Elizabeth, filed a lawsuit against the corrupt Corwin. Their statement in court read, "After our father's death, the sheriff threatened to seize our father's estate, and for fear we complied with him and paid him 11 pounds 6 shillings in money." It turned out there were demons in Salem, but not of the spectral form, just your average corrupt human being. Now you need to watch why the Dark Ages were the worst time to be alive, or have a look at executions that went horribly wrong.